Why you feel like you don't belong anywhere. Carl Jung observed that the ache of not belonging almost never comes from the number of people standing near you. It comes from something quieter and far more private, something that has nothing to do with how full or empty the room is. As Jung wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, loneliness does not come from having no people about one, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself. And if you have ever sat in a warm, crowded room, full of laughter and easy conversation, and still felt like a stranger watching through glass, that sentence is not describing a mood, it is describing a mechanism, a very exact one. And once you see how it works, you will never again mistake the ache for proof that something is wrong with you. The first key is this: the ache you feel is the shape of an unshared chamber, not a flaw, not a diagnosis, not a sign of some social defect you were born with, but the outline of a room inside you that has never yet found a door wide enough for another person to walk through. And notice how specific that image is: a room, with walls, with a shape all its own, not a hole, not an absence, a chamber that is actually full. Jung himself carried a memory of this from very early childhood. As a boy, he carved a small mannequin out of wood, painted it, wrapped it, and hid it in a pencil case in the attic of his house. He told no one. He visited it in secret. He kept a tiny scroll of writing with it, in a language only he understood. And he wrote later that this mannequin held a whole private world, a whole language that was entirely his own. And he understood only decades afterward that this was his first encounter with the fact that every psyche carries a chamber like this, some corner too particular, too textured, too much your own to translate into the ordinary traffic of small talk. Think of your own version of that attic. Perhaps it is not a carved figure, but a thought you turn over on a long drive, or a private grief you have never once said aloud, or a whole interior weather system running quietly under a perfectly ordinary Wednesday, while you answer emails and nod along in meetings. That chamber is not sitting empty, waiting to be diagnosed as loneliness. It is sitting full, waiting for a door. So when you feel that you do not belong anywhere, notice first that this is not the same claim as I am unlikable or I am too strange for people. It is closer to this: I am carrying something rich enough that I have not yet found the right form to give it. That is not a wound, that is evidence of depth. So the resolution to carry out of this first key is simple. I will stop mistaking my depth for a defect. I will stop mistaking my depth for a defect. The second key is this: the wall you built was never against people. It was built against being misunderstood again. And this is where the ache stops being abstract and becomes something you can actually locate in your own week. Think of an ordinary Tuesday. Someone across the table asks how you are, and you say fine, thank you, and how are you? But that very morning, in the shower or on the drive-in, you had been turning over something that actually mattered to you. A thought about your father getting older, a piece of music that undid you, for reasons you could not explain, a fear about the shape your life is taking, and you did not bring any of it to the table, not because the person was unkind, but because some earlier version of you already ran the experiment, said the real thing once, plainly, and met a blank look, or a quick change of subject, or a kindly meant but deflating, well, that's a bit heavy for now. And from that exchange, which you may not even consciously remember, a small efficient habit was built. Translate everything down to weather, keep the exchange light, keep the real material inside. And notice how quietly this habit spreads once it is installed. It does not stay confined to strangers or acquaintances. It creeps into the conversations that matter most. You find yourself giving your closest friend the same weather report you give the cashier. You find yourself telling your own partner that work was fine, that you are just tired, when what is actually sitting in you is something closer to grief, or doubt, or a longing you cannot yet name. The wall does not check credentials before it goes up. It simply rises wherever the old wound might be touched again. And this is precisely why the ache follows you into rooms full of people who love you. The wall was never built with a sign on it saying, "Keep out everyone except the people who are safe." It was built in a hurry, after one bad exchange. and it has been standing guard indiscriminately ever since. This habit works. It keeps rooms comfortable. It keeps you employable and pleasant, and easy to be around. And it is also, quietly, the very wall now producing the feeling that you belong nowhere, because a life lived entirely in the light register starts to feel thin from the inside, like eating only the garnish and calling it dinner. You can perform this for years, and many people do, arriving at 40 or 50, wondering why every relationship they have feels pleasant but strangely weightless, as though nothing has ever quite touched down. Notice this week where you performed the light version of yourself when the real version was sitting right there unused. Not to shame the performance, it often has its place, but to see clearly that the wall and the ache are the same structure viewed from two sides. So speak this line quietly. I built the wall to protect something tender, not to punish myself. I built the wall to protect something tender, not to punish myself. The third key is this. More people in the room does not fix it, because the problem was never a head count, and this is worth sitting with slowly, because most of us have already run the experiment without calling it an experiment. Imagine a large family gathering, a long table, cousins and aunts and uncles, plates passed, old jokes repeated, the room loud with genuine affection. And imagine you are seated right in the middle of it, surrounded on every side, and still, somewhere around the second hour, a familiar hollowness opens up in you, quiet, almost embarrassing, because by every visible measure, you are the opposite of alone. You have tried adding people to this feeling before, more guests, more plans, a fuller calendar, and it never actually closes the gap. It only postpones noticing it, because the ache was never a measurement of bodies in a room. It was always a measurement of how much of what actually matters to you found its way into speech. Jung understood this so completely that in his own later years, famous, sought after, surrounded by patients and colleagues and correspondents from around the world, he still protected long stretches of deliberate solitude. In 1957, in a letter to a man named Schmaltz, who had wanted to visit him, Jung, then 81, declined, and he explained himself in a line that has stayed remarkably intact. Solitude is for me a fount of healing, which makes my life worth living. Think about what that means. Coming from a man who was never short of company, who could have filled every hour of every day with visitors and admirers, he still chose to close the door, not because people exhausted him in some petty sense, but because he understood something you may already sense, but have not yet named. That presence without communicability is just a more crowded version of the same isolation. A room full of people you cannot be honest with is not less lonely than an empty room. In some ways it is more lonely, because the emptiness of an actual empty room is at least honest about itself, while a crowded room that offers no real exchange asks you to perform belonging you do not feel. And this performance has a cost that accumulates quietly. You smile at the joke you have heard 100 times. You nod along to the small talk. You leave 3 hours later having said many words and communicated almost nothing. And you wonder, driving home in the dark, why you feel further from people than before you saw them. This is not a failure of gratitude, and it is not proof that something is wrong with the people who love you. It is simply the mechanism doing what it always does, counting warmth as though it were the same thing as understanding, when the two are related but never identical. So this is worth naming plainly. If you have ever left a party feeling more hollow than before you arrived, that is not a personality problem. That is exactly what Jung was describing. A night full of people and empty of communication will always weigh more than an evening alone with an honest book, or an honest walk, or an honest hour with your own thoughts. Because solitude that is chosen and used well can actually feed you in a way that unshared company cannot. So name this decree: I will stop counting company as connection. I will stop counting company as connection. The fourth key is this, and here the lens turns toward you directly, because somewhere in your own history there is an exact afternoon, not a vague childhood in general, one specific afternoon, when you offered something tender, a real thought, a real feeling, a real piece of your inner chamber, to someone who mattered to you, and it landed wrong. Maybe they laughed at the wrong moment. Maybe they went quiet, in a way that felt like judgment. Maybe they simply forgot what you told them by the next day, as though it had cost you nothing to say it. You can probably find that afternoon, if you sit with this for a moment. And it is worth actually sitting with it, not skimming past it the way we skim past most of our own history. Because the mind likes to file these moments as small, as forgettable, as nothing, and yet the body remembers them with a precision the conscious mind does not grant them. Imagine a woman in her 40s who cannot understand why she goes quiet in every new friendship, right at the point where it could deepen. She is warm at first, easy, funny even. People like her instantly, but there is a threshold, always the same threshold, just past the stage of pleasant familiarity, where she pulls back without quite deciding to. And if you asked her why, she would say she does not know. She would say that is just how she is. Some people are simply private, but if she were patient enough to trace it, she might land on a particular dinner table from 30 years earlier, a night she finally told her family something that frightened her, a fear about not being good enough, spoken plainly, at an age when plainness still felt possible, and the table went quiet. And then someone changed the subject to something practical. "Pass the bread. What time is the film starting?" And nothing cruel was said. Nothing was said at all. That is precisely the point. The silence itself was the verdict. No one needed to punish her. The subject simply moved on without her in it. And a child watching that moment does not conclude my family is having an off night. A child concludes this is what happens when I show the real thing. And that conclusion, formed in an instant, unexamined for decades, is still quietly running her adult friendships. Notice how the mechanism does not need cruelty to install itself. It only needs one moment of mismatch between what you offered and what was received. A single afternoon can outvote 1,000 ordinary ones, because the psyche is not a fair court that weighs all the evidence equally. It is closer to a nervous animal that only needs to be burned once by the stove to avoid every stove afterward, including the ones that were never hot. This is what a contract of this kind actually is, not a decision you made consciously and could therefore unmake with a little willpower, but a reflex installed in a moment of exposure. And reflexes do not consult you before they fire. They simply fire, and afterward you feel the ache and call it loneliness, or call it not belonging anywhere, when what is actually happening is much more specific than that. An old verdict is being applied to a new room that never agreed to the trial. Think of your own week again, not in the abstract now, but concretely. Was there a moment recently where you felt the pull to say something real and then watched yourself retreat from it, not because the person in front of you gave any actual sign of rejection, but because some faster, older part of you had already run the calculation and returned its answer before the newer, wiser part of you even got to weigh in? That speed is the tell. Real present tense judgment about a real person takes a little time. It requires watching, listening, weighing what kind of listener they actually are. But the old verdict is instant. It does not wait to gather evidence about this particular person in this particular room. It simply applies the ruling from the earlier case. And because it moves so fast, it feels like intuition. It feels like knowing, when it is really just memory wearing the costume of foresight. This is worth naming honestly. Loneliness of this kind is not a badge of sensitivity to wear with a certain quiet pride. It is not evidence that you simply feel things more deeply than other people, and therefore cannot be understood. That story is comforting because it flatters you, even while it isolates you. But it is not accurate. It is closer to a cost report, a running tally kept somewhere below conscious accounting. Every time you decided the real material was too risky to bring, every time you offered the light version instead of the true one, added silently to a ledger you never chose to open. And the tally grows heavier the longer it goes unexamined, not because the world keeps rejecting you, but because you keep sentencing new people before they have had any chance to plead their case. Jung would say that whatever is not made conscious in a person does not simply disappear. It keeps organizing behavior from underneath. An old unspoken verdict about being misunderstood does not need your permission to keep steering the way you show up in rooms. It will steer you anyway, quietly, from the position of a fact you never revisited, as though it were settled law rather than one ruling from one afternoon, decades old, delivered by people who themselves were likely just as frightened and just as unable to communicate as you were. So this week, if you can, try to actually locate that afternoon, not to relive it, not to grieve it dramatically, only to notice plainly that it happened once, to one version of you, in one specific room, with one specific set of people who may have had no idea what they were teaching you, and that it is currently being applied as though it were a universal law about all rooms and all people for the rest of your life. That is worth questioning honestly. The verdict was local. The application has become global, and closing that gap, even a little, even just in your own noticing, is how the ledger finally stops growing. So hold this line. The old verdict, it does not get to run every new room. The old verdict does not get to run every new room. The fifth key is this. The material you have been keeping unsaid is not proof that you are unfit for connection. It is raw material waiting for the right form and the right listener. And this distinction matters more than it first appears, because the mind under pressure tends to collapse two very different questions into one. The question, "Can this be said?" becomes silently replaced by the question, "Can this be said here, right now, to this person, in this tone?" And once those two questions get fused, a single failed attempt starts to feel like a permanent verdict on the material itself, rather than what it actually was, a mismatch of container. Imagine a woman who for years has carried a quiet grief about a choice she made in her 20s, a path not taken, a version of her life that closed off. She mentioned it once at a dinner, lightly, almost as a joke, and someone at the table said, "Oh, don't be so dramatic, everyone has regrets," and laughed, and the table moved on. Nothing cruel happened, no one meant harm, and yet something inside her filed the report instantly. This cannot be said, and for years afterward, she carried that grief the way you carry a stone in a coat pocket, always slightly aware of its weight, never quite setting it down. What she never questioned was the size of the sample. One dinner table, one slightly wrong evening, one listener who happened to be tired or distracted, or simply not built to receive something that size at that hour, became, in her private accounting, proof about all people everywhere for the rest of her life. That is how the unsaid calcifies, not through one dramatic betrayal, but through a small, ordinary mismatch that gets promoted, quietly, into a universal law. Jung's own practice is worth returning to here, because he did not treat solitude as a retreat from people. He treated it as a workshop, a place where the raw and formless parts of the inner life could be turned over slowly, examined from several angles, given shape before they were ever handed to another person at all. At his tower at Bollingen, he would carve stone, walk the shoreline, sit for long hours doing nothing that looked like productivity to an outside observer. And what he was actually doing was letting the unformed material of his own depths find its edges. A feeling that arrives as pure weight, pure heaviness, with no words attached to it yet, is not ready to be spoken. It will only come out as a groan, or a joke that lands wrong, or silence. But the same feeling, given time, given a quiet page, given a long walk where nothing needs resolving, slowly acquires a shape, a beginning, a middle, an actual sentence, and a feeling with a shape can be offered to another person in a way that a formless weight cannot. So part of what keeps your chamber locked may not be the listener at all. It may simply be that the material inside has never been given the time to become sayable. You have been reaching for the door before the room was even furnished. Here is a practice worth taking seriously this week. Call it a communicability audit. At the end of each day, quietly, without performance, ask yourself two plain questions. What did I not say today that actually mattered to me? And to whom would I have said it, if I had believed it would land? Write both answers down. A single line is enough, not to fix anything immediately, not to rehearse a speech you will give tomorrow, only to see the pattern. Over a week or two of doing this honestly, you will very likely notice the same handful of things recurring, the same worry about your health you keep almost mentioning, the same tenderness toward an old friend you keep almost expressing, the same fear about the direction your work has taken. And you will likely notice the same handful of people you keep almost telling, a partner, a sibling, an old friend, from a life you thought you had left behind. That pattern is not an accusation against you, and it is not evidence that you are broken or unusually guarded. It is simply a map. It shows you exactly where the unshared chamber presses hardest against the wall, and often, gently, it shows you something else too. It shows you who among the people already in your life might actually be able to receive more of the real material than you have quietly decided they can. Not everyone. That much is true. Most people were never meant to hold your deepest chamber, and expecting every acquaintance to bear the full weight of it would be its own kind of mistake. But usually, if you look honestly at the audit, there is someone, even one person, who has already shown, in small ways you may have dismissed, that they could bear more truth than you have risked offering them. And there is a second discipline worth naming alongside the audit. Before you decide the material cannot be spoken to anyone, first ask whether it has been given a form at all. Take the heavy, wordless thing and write it as a single, honest paragraph to no one, just for yourself. Notice what happens to a feeling once it has been forced into sentences. It rarely stays as frightening as it was while it was still shapeless. A fear looked at directly and written down plainly is almost always smaller than a fear left circling in the dark unspoken. This is not a trick to make the pain disappear. It is simply what happens when raw material meets form. The chamber stops pressing so hard against the wall the moment it has even one shape it can take, even before another person is involved at all. So the invitation this week is not to march into the next room and announce your deepest grief to whoever happens to be sitting there. That would only produce another mismatched afternoon like the dinner table story. The invitation is slower and more patient than that. Give the unsaid material time and a page. Let it find its shape in solitude first, the way Jung let his own depths find their shape at the lake. And then, when the shape is ready, look honestly at your own audit and choose one person the pattern has already pointed toward, and offer them one true sentence, not the whole chamber, one sentence. So hold this decree: I will find the right form before I decide no one can hold it. I will find the right form before I decide no one can hold it. The sixth key is this: the deepest belonging you are actually reaching for was never going to come from a crowd, and it was never going to come from solitude alone either. It comes from a rhythm between the two, held steadily over years, not a single dramatic choice, but a pattern you return to again and again. And this is the part most people skip past too quickly, because they hear the word solitude and assume it means retreat, and they hear the word belonging and assume it means more people, when in fact Jung spent much of his later life proving that both halves need each other, the way breathing needs both the inhale and the exhale. You cannot live on one alone, and you cannot live on the other alone either, no matter how convincing either extreme feels while you are inside it. Imagine a man who works from home. His week is built almost entirely out of video calls. Back to back, 5, 6, sometimes 8 in a day, faces in small boxes, brisk agendas, a running total of decisions made. And by every outward measure, this is a connected life. He is seen constantly. He speaks constantly. His calendar has almost no empty square in it. And yet by Thursday evening, something in him has gone quiet and flat, in a way he cannot quite name. He tells his partner he is just tired, and he is, but it is not the tiredness of exertion. It is the tiredness of 100 exchanges that never once touched the actual weather inside him. Then the weekend arrives, and something in him swings hard the other way. He cancels the plans he had half agreed to. He turns his phone face down. He spends 2 full days in near silence. And at first, this feels like relief, like finally breathing. But by Sunday night, a different kind of hollowness has crept in, quieter, harder to name. The sense that he has now gone an entire weekend, without a single person actually knowing what these last few months have been like for him. And Monday arrives, and the calls begin again, and the whole cycle repeats. Week after week, and if you asked him why he still feels like he belongs nowhere, despite being surrounded by faces all day, and despite having plenty of solitude on the weekends, he would not have an easy answer, because the honest answer is that he has two windows in his life, and neither one is actually open. The outward window is crowded with talk that carries no real weight, and the inward window is sealed so tightly that nothing gathered in solitude ever makes it back out to another person. This is worth sitting with, because it is not really about how much time is spent with people or without them. It is about whether either window is doing its true work. An outward window that is full of talk but empty of honesty is not really open. It only looks open. And an inward window that is full of quiet but never lets anything back out is not really restorative. It becomes its own kind of sealed room. Jung's own arrangement at his tower on the lake looked, from the outside, like a simple alternation: weeks of visitors and correspondence, and long seminars, then stretches where he closed the gate and told almost no one where he was. But the deeper pattern underneath that alternation was not merely time spent alone versus time spent with others. It was that the solitude was used to gather and shape what mattered. The carving, the long, unhurried walks, the letters he wrote slowly by hand, and then the company that followed was used to actually offer some of what had been gathered. Not everything, never everything, but something real. So the rhythm was not simply on then off, crowd then quiet. It was gather then give. And this is the piece that is so easy to miss when you are only counting hours. Think about your own week the same way now, not asking how many hours you spent with people and how many alone, but asking a sharper question of each stretch of time. When I was with others this week, was I actually offering anything true, or only trading pleasantries back and forth like coins that never change hands in any meaningful way? And when I was alone this week, was that solitude actually doing anything? Was it sorting something, settling something, shaping some piece of the unsaid material into a form? Or was it simply a screen, a scroll, a numbing hour that looked like rest, but left nothing changed? Because there is a kind of aloneness that heals, and there is a kind that merely anesthetizes, and they can look identical from the outside, the same closed door, the same quiet room, and only you, from the inside, can tell which one you are actually living in on any given evening. Notice too that the ache of not belonging often spikes hardest right at the seam between these two states. The drive home after a long day of talk that never once became honest. The Sunday evening after a weekend of silence that never once became shared. These seams are not accidents. They are the exact places where the rhythm has gone lopsided. And the correction is rarely dramatic. It is rarely quitting your job, or moving away, or cutting people off. It is smaller and steadier than that. It looks like choosing, once this week, to let one of those calls or dinners carry one true sentence instead of 10 pleasant ones. And it looks like choosing, once this week, to let one of those quiet hours actually do something. A page written honestly, a walk taken without a phone, rather than another hour spent scrolling in a room that only looks like solitude. Over time, these small corrections accumulate, the way the earlier wounds once accumulated. Except now they are building toward a different verdict, one that says the real material can be gathered in quiet and it can be offered in company. Both are possible, both are survivable, and neither one, on its own, was ever going to be enough. So the discipline here is less about finding the right people and more about protecting this rhythm the way you would protect anything that actually feeds you. Some weeks will lean toward gathering, some weeks will lean toward offering. That unevenness is not failure, it is simply the tide of an ordinary life. What matters is that neither window stays permanently shuttered, that the outward window keeps getting tested, gently, with small true sentences, and that the inward window keeps getting used, honestly, for something more than escape. Belonging, understood this way, stops being a place you either arrive at or fail to reach, and becomes instead a practice you return to, imperfectly, across years. gathering in solitude, offering in company, gathering again, which is very likely closer to what Jung meant when he called solitude a fount of healing rather than a hiding place. A fount is something you return to again and again, not something you build once and then live inside forever. So hold this final line. I will build the rhythm, solitude that restores me, and honesty that finally meets someone. I will build the rhythm, solitude that restores me, and honesty that finally meets someone. Here is the whole picture. The ache is the shape of an unshared chamber, not a flaw. The wall was built to protect something tender, not to punish you. More company was never the cure, because the problem was never a head count. The old verdict from one afternoon has been running every new room since. The unsaid material only needs the right form and the right listener, not permanent silence. And the real belonging you want is a rhythm, solitude that restores, and honest meeting that finally lands. None of this asks you to become someone louder or someone smaller. It only asks you to notice, this week, exactly where the chamber presses against the wall, and to bring one true thing, to one real person, or even just to one honest page. So if any part of this named something you have been carrying quietly for a long time, the only real invitation tonight is to face it, simply and without drama. Face it,